The prairie wind soughed across the endless Montana plains as Owen Croft stood in his ranch house doorway, watching the latest mail-order bride climb into the departing wagon. That made 7. 7 women who had taken one look at his remote homestead, his hulking frame, and the sheer emptiness of the land, and fled back to civilization in under a week. The wagon wheels groaned against the hard-packed earth as it disappeared over a rise, leaving him alone once again with nothing but the vast sky and his own stubborn pride. Owen closed the heavy wooden door and leaned his substantial weight against it, running a hand through his thinning brown hair. He had built a life of solitude out here, carving a cattle ranch from unforgiving land. But the isolation was a heavy cloak, and his size, a constant source of shame, felt heavier still. Each failed attempt to find a wife only reinforced what the mirror told him every morning. No woman wanted a life this hard, and no woman wanted a man built like him. They came expecting a lean, rugged cowboy from the advertisements, not a man whose shadow was as wide as his doorway. The marriage broker in Cheyenne had sworn the next candidate would be different. Mai Lin, the letter had said, understood hardship. She was a Chinese woman who had come to America seeking a new life and found only struggle in the crowded, hostile streets of San Francisco. The broker had written of her desperation as a selling point, as if her lack of options would make her more compliant, more grateful for any offer. Owen had winced at the callous tone but agreed. He cared nothing for appearances or origins. What he needed, desperately, was someone who would stay. But as winter's chill crept into the bones of the land, Owen began to doubt that even a desperate woman would be any different. The prairie demanded everything. It stripped away pretense and comfort, and most people, he had learned, were not built for such honesty. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, carried by the last mail rider before the routes became unreliable. Mai Lin would arrive on the December supply wagon, weather permitting. Owen had spent those weeks preparing, as he always did, cleaning the small ranch house, stocking extra provisions, and bracing himself for the familiar sting of another disappointment. Now, as he stoked the fire in his stone hearth, Owen wondered if he should simply give up. Maybe some men were meant to be alone. Maybe the prairie had claimed him so completely there was no room left for another soul. Outside, the wind began its relentless assault. Snow began to fall, fine flakes that would soon blanket the plains and make the passes treacherous. If Mai Lin was coming, she would need to arrive soon, or winter would trap her in the valley until spring. Owen settled into his reinforced chair and opened a book, but his mind kept wandering to the foreign woman who might or might not brave the journey. He tried not to hope. Hope, he had learned, was a luxury he could not afford. The supply wagon arrived on a Tuesday morning, struggling through a thin layer of snow under a pewter sky. The horse's breath plumed like smoke in the bitter air. Owen had been mending a fence when he heard the familiar creak of wheels and jangle of harnesses. He set down his tools and walked to the edge of his property, his heavy boots crunching in the snow, watching the wagon make its slow progress. Behind the driver sat a small figure, bundled so thoroughly in a worn wool coat and scarf that Owen could make out nothing of the person beneath. This had to be Mai Lin. The wagon driver, old Gus, who had been making supply runs for 2 decades, pulled up in front of the ranch house with a grunt. "Got your delivery, Croft," he called out, his voice rough. And I'll tell you, this was a rough one. Weather's turning sour. Mai Lin climbed down from the wagon, her movements careful and deliberate. When she turned to face Owen, she pushed back her scarf, revealing a young woman with dark, intelligent eyes in a pale face. Her eyes held neither the fear nor the disdain he had grown used to. Instead, there was a deep weariness, and a flicker of something else, a desperate, searching hope. She was so small, so slight, she looked as though the prairie wind might carry her away. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice soft, her English careful and accented. "I am Mai Lin. I have come." She bowed her head slightly. Owen nodded, suddenly conscious of his own immense size next to her delicate frame. "Welcome," he gestured toward her small, battered trunk, which Gus was already unloading. "Hope the journey wasn't too bad." "I have endured worse," Mai Lin replied, her gaze sweeping over the vast, snow-dusted landscape, the solid ranch house, and finally, him. Her eyes lingered on his large form for a moment, but her expression remained unreadable. Gus cleared his throat. Hate to rush you, but I need to get moving before this snow gets serious. He handed My Lin her trunk and tipped his hat. Good luck to you both. I'll be back with supplies come spring, assuming you both make it through the winter. As the wagon disappeared, Owen and My Lin stood facing each other in the immense silence. The wind picked up, swirling snow around their feet. Unlike the others, My Lin showed no sign of regret, no panicked glance after the departing wagon. Instead, she clutched her trunk and looked at him. Please, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I will work hard. I will cook and clean. Please, let me stay. Her plea, so different from the silent judgment of the others, caught him off guard. Come inside, he said, his own voice gruff. It's too cold to be out here. My Lin followed him into the ranch house. Owen watched as she took in her new surroundings. The house was simple but sturdy, with a large main room, a small separate bedroom, and a storage pantry. He had built it himself, every log and stone a testament to his lonely labor. You built this, she observed, her voice filled with a quiet awe. She ran a hand along the smooth surface of the dining table. Yes. Took a few years. It is a good house. Strong, she set her trunk down and began to unwrap her scarf. For the first time in a long, long time, Owen felt a flicker of something that wasn't shame or resignation. It might have been hope. My Lin had not come to the prairie with illusions. At 24, she had survived famine in her homeland, a perilous ocean voyage, and 3 years of grueling labor and prejudice in San Francisco. She had watched other women dream of romance, but such luxuries had never been for her. When she saw the advertisement for a mail-order bride, it was a lifeline. She had chosen Owen Croft's profile because his letter, unlike the others, was brutally honest about the isolation and the hardship. He had also been honest about himself, describing himself as a large and plain man. My Lin respected honesty. What she had not expected was the profound sense of peace that settled over her as she unpacked her few belongings in the small bedroom. The house was warm and solid. The silence was a gift after years of city noise. Owen was awkward but courteous that first evening. He had prepared a simple meal of beef stew and clumsy, dense biscuits. It's plain fare, he mumbled, his eyes downcast. My Lin ate gratefully. It is good, she told him, and meant it. You have a home. You have food. You are a wealthy man, Mr. Croft. He looked up, surprised. Most folks wouldn't call it that. I can cook, she offered. And mend, and tend a garden. I will earn my keep. You will not regret letting me stay. Owen looked at her, at the fierce determination in her dark eyes. It's not about earning your keep, Miss Lin. It's about surviving. This land doesn't care how hard you work. It'll take you all the same if you're not careful. My Lin nodded, but she also heard the deep loneliness in his voice, a loneliness that mirrored her own. The first week passed quietly. Owen rose before dawn to tend his small herd of cattle, his large frame moving with a surprising efficiency. My Lin learned the rhythms of the house. She mended his worn clothes with neat, invisible stitches, and she transformed his simple pantry, creating meals with flavor and care that he hadn't experienced in years. She did not complain about the cold, the isolation, or the work. When the wind howled at night, she did not cower in fear, she simply added another log to the fire. Owen began to relax. He found himself explaining the patterns of the weather, showing her how to read the sky. She listened with an intense focus, asking practical questions. The snow will get deeper, he told her one evening. By January, we'll be snowed in for weeks. No way in or out until spring. Then we must be prepared, she replied calmly. The simple phrase, we must, hung in the air between them, and Owen felt a tight knot in his chest begin to loosen. That evening, as they shared a meal of savory rice and preserved vegetables she had made, she surprised him. She gestured around the small, warm room. 7 women, she stated, more than asked. He had told her about them in a brief, pained explanation on her second day. He nodded, waiting for the inevitable question, the one that would lead to her departure. Why they leave? She asked. This is a good home. He set down his fork, the old shame rising. He couldn't find the words, so he just looked down at his own large hands, his broad chest. They expected someone else. A different kind of man. Mai Lin considered this. Then she looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering. They are foolish, she said softly. They see only the shell. They do not see the strong house, the kind hands that built it. They do not see a good man. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever called him a good man, let alone looked past his size to see the person within. The third week brought the first serious test. A blizzard swept down from the north with terrifying speed, burying the prairie in a howling white void that lasted for 3 days. The wind drove snow against the house with such force that the walls groaned. Owen, who had weathered such storms alone many times, found it different with Mai Lin there. The small space felt charged with her quiet presence. But if Mai Lin felt trapped, she gave no sign. She occupied herself with mending, cooking, and organizing. She seemed to draw strength from the storm's fury, her calm a quiet anchor in the chaos. On the second day, Owen noticed her watching him pace. You worry, she observed. He stopped, surprised she had noticed. The north wall, he admitted. A weak spot. The wind is pushing hard. Show me, she said simply. He led her to a corner where a fine powder of snow was being driven through a tiny gap between 2 logs. Mai Lin examined it, then disappeared into the pantry. She returned with strips of cloth and a small pot of lard. We must pack it, she said. Together, they worked to seal the gap, her small, nimble fingers proving more adept at forcing the makeshift sealant into the narrow space than his own. As they worked side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing, he was acutely aware of her closeness. There, she said, stepping back. It will hold. Thank you, Owen said. I'm so used to being alone, I forget that 2 people can solve a problem better than one. Mai Lin looked at him, her dark eyes thoughtful. Is that why you wanted a wife? For help? Part of it, he admitted. But not the biggest part. What is biggest part? He struggled for the words. The quiet, he said finally. It gets so quiet out here, you start to wonder if you're still real. Mai Lin nodded, a deep understanding in her eyes. In the city, there was always noise, she said. But it was the noise of strangers. It makes you feel invisible. This quiet is different. It has room. Room for 2 people. Owen asked, his voice rough with emotion. We will see, she replied, but her tone suggested she believed they would. When the storm broke, they emerged to a world transformed, buried under a pristine blanket of white that glittered under a brilliant blue sky. It is beautiful, Mai Lin breathed, her face turned to the sun. Owen found himself looking at her instead of the landscape, at the wonder in her expression. Yes, he agreed quietly. It is. The long winter months forged them into a true partnership. Owen taught Mai Lin how to handle a rifle, not as a helper but as an equal. If we're going to survive here, he'd said, you need to know how to take care of yourself. She practiced with a fierce determination, her small frame surprisingly steady as she learned to shoot. They learned each other's stories. She told him of her village in China, of the family she had lost. He told her of his own lonely childhood, of his decision to head west to build a life where his size wouldn't be a constant source of ridicule. They found a common language not just in words, but in shared work and mutual respect. One evening in early January, as she was teaching him how to fold dumplings, he found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting him. Are you happy here, Mai Lin? She paused, her hand still. She looked around the warm, firelit room, then met his gaze. I have a safe home. I have food. I have a kind man who treats me with respect. She paused, then gave him a small, shy smile. I have never been happier. Later that night, Owen lay in his bed, listening to the wind outside and the soft sound of Mai Lin's breathing from the other room. The other women had wanted a fantasy. My Lin had come seeking only survival, and in doing so, had found a home. And he, who had given up on ever finding a partner, had found something more. Spring came late, but it came with a sense of renewal that was more than just the melting snow. They worked together to plant a large garden, My Lin's knowledge of herbs and vegetables far surpassing his own. She suggested expanding the chicken coop, and he began building an addition to the house. A workshop, she'd suggested. For your leatherwork, and for my sewing. And maybe, for later the unspoken word, nursery, hung between them, full of promise. The arrival of the first supply wagon brought Gus, whose jaw dropped when he saw them working together in the garden, laughing over a stubborn root. "Well, I'll be," he said, looking from Owen to My Lin and back again. "Looks like this one's a sticker, Croft." "She is," Owen replied, placing a hand gently on My Lin's shoulder. "We're building a life here." Among the supplies was a letter from the marriage broker. He was inquiring about the arrangement and offering to send other candidates if this one hadn't worked out. Owen showed it to My Lin. She read it, then looked up at him with a smile that lit up her whole face. "Tell him," she said, "that his services are no longer needed. Tell him the obese cowboy has found his wife, and she has begged to stay forever." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Owen reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 7 women had seen only a large, lonely man and a hard life. But the 8th, a small woman from across the world, had looked past the surface. She had come seeking a refuge and had, in turn, become his. Their love story wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real, built not on fantasy, but on the solid ground of shared work, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding between 2 lonely souls who had finally, against all odds, found their home. If this story touched your heart, drop a like and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I love hearing from viewers around the world. Also, do subscribe for more tales from the Wild West. Until next time, keep your hearts open to second chances and love in life.